In a small, divided town, a powerful black judge crosses paths with a racist police chief who believes in maintaining a prejudiced status quo. When a routine confrontation spirals into a public spectacle, both men's lives are thrust into a dramatic battle that will shake the community to its core. What shocking truths will be revealed, and can justice prevail when the odds seem insurmountable? Before we dive into this unforgettable story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will leave you inspired. The small town of Westbridge sat nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and old oak trees. It was a town of contradictions, quaint, yet burdened by a history its residents rarely spoke of aloud. While some streets gleamed with fresh paint and trimmed hedges, others bore the weight of neglect, as if time had forgotten them entirely. The air buzzed with an unspoken hierarchy, an invisible barrier separating its diverse population. Richard Murdoch was the embodiment of this hierarchy. As the police chief of Westbridge for nearly 2 decades, Murdoch had carved out his role with an iron fist. He wasn't a man given to self-reflection. He believed his gut instincts were the law, both literally and figuratively. He strode through the precinct with an air of unquestioned authority, his towering frame and steely blue eyes daring anyone to challenge him. Murdoch was a man of rituals. His mornings began with a black coffee, brewed strong enough to strip paint, in the town's local newspaper. He always read the obituaries first. Something about knowing who was gone gave him a twisted sense of order. This morning, however, something else caught his eye. On the front page, a photo of Judge Adrian Carter, Westbridge's newest appointee, standing outside the courthouse. Carter's confident smile and sharp gray suit radiated professionalism. The headline read, "Change comes to Westbridge, Judge Adrian Carter sworn in." Murdoch's lip curled as he read the article. "Change," he muttered under his breath. He tossed the paper onto his desk, his mind already racing. He hadn't met Carter yet, but he didn't need to. Men like Carter, educated, polished, and in Murdoch's eyes, too self-assured, represented everything he distrusted. Adrian Carter was already settling into his new home, a modest but well-kept craftsman house on the edge of town. He stood in his living room, arranging books on the shelves with the precision of someone who cherished knowledge. His collection spanned history, law, and the occasional novel for leisure. As he placed a worn copy of The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois in its rightful spot, he paused to admire the view from his window. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden hue over his front yard. For Adrian, Westbridge represented a fresh start, a chance to bring justice to a community long overshadowed by its inequities. At 43, he was one of the youngest judges ever appointed in the county, a milestone he took seriously. He'd grown up in the bustling city of Atlanta, surrounded by a family that had instilled in him the value of hard work and integrity. His parents, both educators, had raised him to believe in the power of change, even in the face of resistance. Adrian's decision to leave the city and take this position in Westbridge hadn't been easy. His wife, Camille, had been hesitant about the move, concerned about the town's reputation for being slow to embrace progress. "Are you sure about this, Adrian?" she had asked during one of their long discussions. "I'm sure," he had replied, his voice steady. "This is exactly where I need to be." Now, as he stood in his new home, Adrian felt a sense of purpose. He was ready to make a difference, even if it meant facing resistance from people like Richard Murdoch. Back at the precinct, Murdoch's deputy, Officer Tom Whitaker, entered the office carrying a steaming cup of coffee. Whitaker, a younger man with an eager-to-please demeanor, had been under Murdoch's wing since joining the force 5 years ago. "Morning," Chief Whitaker greeted, placing the coffee on Murdoch's desk. Murdoch grunted in response, his eyes still fixed on the newspaper. After a moment, he held it up for Whitaker to see. "You read this yet?" Whitaker glanced at the headline and shrugged. "Yeah, looks like the town's got itself a new judge. Seems like a sharp guy." Murdoch shot him a glare. "Sharp guy, huh? We'll see about that." Whitaker shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension in Murdoch's tone. He decided not to press further and left the room, leaving Murdoch to stew in his thoughts. The first time Adrian and Murdoch crossed paths was at a town council meeting. The council chambers were packed, as residents had gathered to discuss a proposed development project. Adrian, seated at the front of the room, took notes diligently, his pen gliding across the paper with practiced ease. Murdoch entered late, his boots thudding against the wooden floor as he made his way to an empty chair. He surveyed the room, his eyes landing on Adrian. Their gazes met for a brief moment, and Murdoch's expression hardened. Adrian, ever composed, offered a polite nod before returning his attention to the speaker at the podium. Throughout the meeting, Murdoch couldn't shake his irritation. Adrian's calm demeanor and articulate questions grated on him, as though the judge's very presence was a challenge to his authority. When the meeting adjourned, Murdoch made a point to approach him. "You're the new judge," Murdoch said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, almost aggressive. "That's right," Adrian replied, matching the handshake with equal confidence. "Adrian Carter, and you must be Chief Murdoch." Murdoch nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Welcome to Westbridge. Hope you're ready for it. This town's not as forgiving as it might seem." Adrian smiled politely, sensing the underlying hostility. "I'm here to serve justice, Chief. Forgiveness isn't my job." The tension between them was palpable, drawing the attention of nearby council members. One of them, a petite woman named Gloria Samuels, quickly intervened. "Chief, Judge Carter, wonderful to see you both here. I'm sure the two of you will work together splendidly." Both men forced smiles, but the unspoken animosity lingered as they parted ways. Later that evening, Adrian decided to explore the town on foot. He laced up his running shoes and headed out for a jog, hoping to clear his mind. The streets were quiet, the occasional bark of a dog or hum of a passing car breaking the stillness. As he ran, Adrian observed the subtle divides within Westbridge, the manicured lawns of one neighborhood giving way to cracked sidewalks and shuttered storefronts in another. Adrian's thoughts drifted to the challenges ahead. He knew he would face resistance, not just from Murdoch but from others who clung to the town's old ways. Yet he was determined to prove that justice could prevail, even in a place like this. Unbeknownst to Adrian, Murdoch was watching from his patrol car parked along a side street. The chief had been making his rounds when he spotted Adrian jogging through a neighborhood he considered off-limits for someone of his stature or his skin color. "What's he doing here?" Murdoch muttered to himself, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. As Adrian approached the intersection where Murdoch's car was parked, the chief stepped out, blocking his path. "Evening," Murdoch said, his tone carrying a hint of suspicion. "Evening," Chief Adrian replied, his breathing steady from the run. "What brings you out here this time of night?" Adrian raised an eyebrow, just getting a feel for the town. "Is that a problem?" Murdoch's jaw tightened. "Depends. This isn't exactly the best part of town. Might not be safe for someone like you." Adrian's expression remained calm, but his tone carried a sharp edge. "I appreciate your concern, Chief, but I can take care of myself." The exchange hung in the air like a storm cloud, each man unwilling to back down. Finally, Murdoch stepped aside, his eyes lingering on Adrian as he continued his jog. "Be careful out there," Murdoch called after him, though the words sounded more like a warning than a gesture of goodwill. Adrian didn't respond. He kept running, his resolve stronger than ever. The tension between Judge Adrian Carter and Police Chief Richard Murdoch simmered long before their second encounter. Westbridge was a town that prided itself on tradition, a euphemism for the unspoken rules that governed its social hierarchy. Adrian's appointment as judge was a direct challenge to that unyielding system, though not everyone saw it that way. Many in the town welcomed the change, but Murdoch saw it as the beginning of disorder, a disruption to the balance he believed he maintained. Adrian Carter, however, didn't come to Westbridge to make friends, he came to make a difference. Aware of the deep-seated prejudice woven into the fabric of the town, he was determined to use his position to bring fairness and accountability. What he didn't anticipate was how quickly his resolve would be tested. It started with a routine morning. Adrian had spent the early hours reviewing case files in his study. As a judge, he believed preparation was everything, and he took pride in understanding each case in depth. The docket was filled with the usual small-town disputes, minor thefts, petty vandalism, and the occasional domestic issue. But one case stood out, a hearing involving allegations of police misconduct. It wasn't the first time Adrian had dealt with such issues, but this case felt different. The complainant, a young black man named Jamal Green, alleged that he had been stopped, frisked, and humiliated by Officer Tom Whitaker without cause. Adrian noticed the name Murdoch mentioned in the report. While Whitaker had conducted the stop, it was Murdoch who had dismissed the young man's complaint internally, deeming it unsubstantiated. Adrian's jaw tightened as he read the details. He knew addressing systemic issues in Westbridge wouldn't be easy, but this case underscored the challenges ahead. He filed the case notes carefully and resolved to remain impartial, knowing that his actions would be scrutinized by both the community and the law enforcement establishment. Meanwhile, Murdoch was making his rounds through town. Driving his patrol car through Westbridge's winding streets, he felt a sense of ownership over the town. To him, every block, every alley, was his to protect or control. He prided himself on knowing everyone in the community, or at least believing he did. When he spotted Adrian jogging again that morning, his mood darkened. Adrian was running through the east side of town, a predominantly working-class neighborhood. To Murdoch, it wasn't the kind of place a man like Adrian should be wandering around, and certainly not without good reason. The chief pulled his car to the curb and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. Adrian slowed his pace as he approached, recognizing the figure standing in his path. "Morning, Chief," Adrian said evenly, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Morning," Murdoch replied, though his tone lacked warmth. "You seem to enjoy running through town." "It's a good way to get familiar with the area," Adrian said, stretching his legs. "And it's peaceful." Murdoch's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'd be careful jogging around here. This part of town can be unpredictable." Adrian's brow furrowed. Unpredictable? Or inconvenient for someone like me? Murdoch stiffened, caught off guard by the directness of the remark. "I'm just saying it's not the safest place to be running alone." Adrian nodded slowly, his expression calm but resolute. "Noted, Chief. Though I'd hope that your department is working to ensure the safety of all residents, regardless of the neighborhood." Murdoch didn't respond immediately. His mind raced with a mix of frustration and suspicion. "You got ID on you?" he asked abruptly. Adrian raised an eyebrow, incredulous. "Excuse me." "Just a routine question," Murdoch said, his voice firm. Adrian's eyes locked onto Murdoch's, and for a moment neither man moved. "Chief, I don't think we need to play this game. You know exactly who I am." Murdoch's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "Humor me." Adrian reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out his wallet and handing over his identification. Murdoch scrutinized it unnecessarily long, his eyes narrowing as he read the name. "Looks like everything checks out," Murdoch finally said, handing the ID back. Adrian took it without a word, his expression unreadable. "Is there anything else, Chief?" "No," Murdoch replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "You have a good day now." Adrian resumed his jog, his steps measured but firm. He didn't look back, but he could feel Murdoch's gaze burning into his back. The encounter left Adrian unsettled but not surprised. As he finished his run and returned home, he replayed the exchange in his mind. It wasn't the first time he'd been profiled, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But it was the first time it had happened so blatantly and by someone in such a powerful position. Adrian took a long shower, letting the hot water wash away the tension. By the time he sat down for breakfast with his wife, Camille, he had composed himself. "How was your run?" she asked, passing him a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. "Eventful," Adrian replied, his tone carefully neutral. Camille looked up from her coffee, her brow furrowing. "Eventful how?" "Chief Murdoch stopped me. Asked for ID." Camille set her mug down, her expression shifting to one of concern. "Why?" "Because I was jogging in the wrong neighborhood," Adrian said, his voice tinged with sarcasm. Camille sighed, her worry evident. "Adrian, we talked about this. You know this town isn't like Atlanta. You have to be careful." "I know," Adrian said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "But I can't let that stop me. If I do, they've already won." At the precinct, Murdoch's mood had soured even further. He replayed the encounter in his mind, irritated by Adrian's calm defiance. The judge's composure had felt like a challenge, a subtle reminder that Murdoch's authority wasn't absolute. "What's got you in a mood?" Chief Officer Whitaker asked as he entered the office. Nothing, Murdoch snapped, though the edge in his voice said otherwise. Whitaker hesitated before continuing. I heard Judge Carter's presiding over that misconduct case next week. The Green kid. Murdoch's eyes narrowed. Yeah, I know. You think it's going to be a problem. Not for us, Murdoch said firmly. The kid's got no case. We followed protocol. Whitaker nodded but didn't look convinced. If you say so, Chief. Murdoch didn't reply. Instead, he turned his attention to the stack of paperwork on his desk, though his thoughts remained on Adrian. Later that evening, the town was abuzz with chatter about the judge and the chief. Word of their tense encounter had spread quickly, fueled by whispers and speculation. At the local diner, a group of residents debated the incident over coffee and pie. You hear about Judge Carter and Chief Murdoch, one man asked, his voice low but eager. Yeah, I heard the chief stopped him for no reason, another replied. Probably just a misunderstanding, a woman interjected, though her tone lacked conviction. Misunderstanding or not, it's about time someone stood up to Murdoch, the first man said. Across town, Adrian prepared for the week ahead. As he reviewed case files in his study, his phone buzzed with a message from a local reporter seeking comment about the encounter. Adrian ignored it, focusing instead on his work. He knew the incident would stir controversy, but he was determined to stay above the fray. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the town lay quiet, its streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. For all its challenges, Westbridge held promise. Adrian was determined to see it through, no matter the obstacles. Adrian Carter had barely settled into his morning routine at the courthouse when the call came through. He was reviewing preliminary motions for a case involving a local business dispute, his office serene save for the occasional rustle of papers. But when his assistant, Laura, knocked gently on his door, he knew something was amiss. Judge Carter, there's someone here to see you, she said hesitantly. Her tone suggested that this was more than a routine visit. Adrian glanced up, adjusting his glasses. Who is it? It's Jamal Green, Laura replied, lowering her voice. He says it's urgent. Adrian's brows knit together as he closed the file in front of him. Send him in. Moments later, Jamal entered the room, his posture tense, his eyes flickering with frustration and unease. The young man looked as though he hadn't slept, his hoodie rumpled and his hands fidgeting at his sides. Mr. Green, Adrian greeted, gesturing for him to take a seat. What brings you here? Jamal sat down but didn't relax. His words came quickly, tumbling over one another. Judge Carter, I don't know who else to talk to. It's happening again. Adrian leaned forward, his tone steady and calming. What's happening again? The police, Jamal said, his voice trembling. They're harassing me. Every time I step outside, they find some excuse to stop me. Last night I was just walking home from work, and Officer Whitaker pulled me over again. Said I looked suspicious. Adrian sighed inwardly. He had seen the pattern too many times before. What happened next? He searched me, my bag, everything. Said it was routine, but it's not routine, Judge Carter. It's harassment. They're trying to intimidate me because of that complaint I filed. Adrian's eyes sharpened. Did you record any of this? Jamal hesitated, then shook his head. No, my phone was dead. But some people in the neighborhood saw it. They know what's going on. Adrian nodded thoughtfully. Jamal, you've done the right thing by coming to me. The legal process can be slow, but I assure you justice will be served. You need to document everything, every interaction, every detail. Jamal's shoulders sagged slightly as if relieved to be heard. Thanks, Judge. I'm tired of this. I understand, Adrian said, his voice firm. But we can't let them silence you. This is exactly why I came here, to make sure people like you have a voice. Across town, Murdoch was stewing in his office. News of Jamal Green's persistence had reached him, and it grated on his nerves. He prided himself on running a tight ship, and to him, a formal complaint against his department was a direct attack on his authority. Whitaker, he barked, motioning for the young officer to enter his office. Yes, Chief Whitaker asked, his nervous energy palpable. What's the latest on Green? Whitaker shifted on his feet. He's been quiet since last night. Didn't cause any trouble. Murdoch frowned. Quiet doesn't mean he's done. Keep an eye on him. Whitaker hesitated. Chief, don't you think we're pushing a little too hard? He hasn't actually done anything wrong. Murdoch's glare could have cut steel. You think you know better than me, Whitaker? Do your job. Yes, sir, Whitaker mumbled, retreating from the office. That evening, Adrian decided to step out for a walk to clear his mind. The air was crisp, and the fading sunlight cast long shadows across the town. He strolled through one of Westbridge's older neighborhoods, appreciating the quiet charm of the tree-lined streets. As he turned a corner, he noticed a commotion ahead. A small crowd had gathered, murmuring and gesturing towards something or someone. Adrian quickened his pace, and soon saw the source of the disturbance: Jamal Green, backed against a wall, with Officer Whitaker standing in front of him, hand resting on his holster. The sight made Adrian's stomach churn. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs. What's going on here? Whitaker looked up, startled. His expression shifted from surprise to irritation. Stay out of this, Judge. This doesn't concern you. I disagree, Adrian said evenly, his tone carrying the weight of authority. He turned to Jamal. Are you all right? Jamal nodded, though his eyes betrayed his fear. I didn't do anything, Judge. He just stopped me out of nowhere. Whitaker's jaw tightened. He fits the description of a suspect we're looking for. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Really? And what description is that? Whitaker faltered, clearly unprepared for the challenge. We got a report of someone loitering around here. He matched the details. Adrian folded his arms. Loitering is not a crime. Do you have any actual evidence, or is this just another fishing expedition? Whitaker's face reddened, and he glanced around, aware of the crowd watching intently. Look, Judge, I'm just doing my job. No, you're abusing your authority, Adrian said, his voice firm but calm. Let this man go. Whitaker hesitated, but the weight of the onlooker's judgment and Adrian's unflinching gaze was too much. He stepped back, his hand falling from his holster. All right, Green. You're free to go, Whitaker muttered. Jamal exhaled shakily and moved to stand beside Adrian. The two walked away together, leaving Whitaker fuming in their wake. The incident quickly became the talk of the town. Videos of the encounter captured by bystanders began circulating on social media. The footage showed Adrian calmly but firmly defending Jamal, while Whitaker struggled to justify his actions. By the next morning, the courthouse was abuzz with chatter. Adrian's actions had earned him admiration from many in the community, but they had also drawn criticism from those loyal to Murdoch. In his office, Murdoch watched the video on his phone, his anger boiling over. He slammed the device onto his desk and glared at Whitaker, who stood awkwardly by the door. You let him make a fool out of you, Murdoch growled. I didn't have a choice, Chief Whitaker said defensively. The crowd was turning against me. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to show control, Murdoch snapped. Now we look weak. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably. What do you want me to do? Murdoch's eyes darkened. We're not letting Carter walk all over us. If he wants a fight, he'll get one. That evening, Adrian sat at his dining table, discussing the day's events with Camille. You're making waves, she said, her tone a mix of pride and concern. That's the point, Adrian replied, though the weight of the day was evident in his voice. But it's not without risks. Murdoch isn't going to back down. Neither are you, Camille said firmly, reaching across the table to take his hand. Adrian smiled faintly. No, I'm not. The stage was set for a larger confrontation, with the lines between justice and authority growing ever more blurred. As Adrian prepared for the battles ahead, he knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice in Westbridge was only just beginning. The viral video of Adrian Carter defending Jamal Green from Officer Whitaker lit a firestorm in Westbridge. For years, the town's deep-seated issues of racial profiling and law enforcement bias had simmered beneath the surface, spoken about in hushed tones or ignored outright. Now, the footage had thrown the town into the national spotlight, with hashtags like Justice for Jamal and Westbridge racism trending online. Local news stations picked up the story, airing interviews with Jamal, his family, and even bystanders who had witnessed the incident. Jamal, initially reluctant to speak out, found himself thrust into the role of a community voice. "They treat us like criminals just because of how we look," Jamal said during one interview, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Judge Carter stood up for me when no one else would. That means a lot, but it shouldn't take a judge stepping in to stop this kind of harassment. It needs to end." Adrian watched the interview at home, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. Camille sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee. "He's brave," Camille said softly. "He shouldn't have to be," Adrian replied. He turned off the television and leaned back in his chair. "This is just the beginning. Murdoch isn't going to take this lying down." Camille studied her husband, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Adrian nodded, though he knew the road ahead would be difficult. "I have to be." Over at the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Murdoch's officers were divided, with some defending their chief's hardline tactics and others quietly questioning his leadership. Whitaker, humiliated by the public backlash, kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with his colleagues. Murdoch, however, was far from retreating. He stood at the center of the briefing room, his presence commanding as he addressed his officers. "Let me make one thing clear," Murdoch began, his voice sharp and unwavering. "We don't back down, we enforce the law, and we do it without apology. Judge Carter might think he's the town's new hero, but he's stepping into a world he doesn't understand." The room was silent, the officers exchanging uneasy glances. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence shaken. "Chief," one officer ventured cautiously, "what if this brings more attention to the department? People are watching now." Murdoch's jaw tightened, and his glare swept over the room. "Then let them watch. We're not doing anything wrong. If you follow protocol, you have nothing to worry about." He paused, his gaze lingering on Whitaker. "And if anyone here can't handle the heat, they know where the door is." The unspoken challenge hung in the air, and no one moved. In the days that followed, the town became a battleground of opinions. Community members gathered in small groups at coffee shops, churches, and even on street corners, debating the incident and its implications. "I don't see what the big deal is," one man said during a discussion at the local diner. "The kid looked suspicious. The cops were just doing their job." "It's not about the kid," a woman replied, her tone exasperated. "It's about how they treat people in this town. You think they would have stopped him if he wasn't black." The debate spilled over into public spaces, with protests forming outside the courthouse and the police station. Signs reading "Justice for Jamal" and "Stop Racial Profiling" bobbed in the air as protesters chanted for accountability. Adrian watched the protests from his office window, a mix of emotions swirling within him. He admired the passion of the demonstrators, but knew that real change would require more than signs and chants. One evening, Adrian received a call from Gloria Samuels, a prominent member of the town council and one of the few officials who had openly supported his appointment. "Adrian, we need to talk," Gloria said without preamble. "Things are escalating, and the council is under pressure to respond." "I understand," Adrian replied. "What's the plan?" "There's talk of launching an independent review of the police department," Gloria explained. "But Murdoch's pushing back hard. He's got a lot of influence, Adrian. He's calling in favors, rallying his supporters." Adrian sighed. "That's not surprising. But an independent review is necessary. The people deserve transparency." Gloria hesitated. "You know this is going to get ugly, right? Murdoch won't go down without a fight." "I'm not afraid of a fight," Adrian said firmly. Gloria's voice softened. "Just be careful. This town has a way of chewing people up and spitting them out." "Thanks for the warning," Adrian said with a small smile. "But I didn't come here to play it safe." The next day, Adrian found himself face to face with Murdoch at a town council meeting. The atmosphere was charged, the room packed with residents eager to see how the council would address the growing unrest. Murdoch sat near the front, his arms crossed and his expression stony. Adrian took a seat across the room, meeting the chief's glare with calm determination. As the meeting began, Gloria addressed the crowd, her voice steady but serious. We are here to discuss the recent incident involving Officer Whitaker and Mr. Jamal Green. This situation has raised significant concerns about policing in our town, and it's clear that action is needed to restore trust. Murdoch leaned forward, his voice cutting through the room. With all due respect, Councilwoman, this department has operated with integrity for years. We don't need an independent review to tell us how to do our jobs. Adrian spoke up, his tone measured but firm. Chief Murdoch, trust isn't built on claims of integrity. It's built on accountability. If your department has nothing to hide, then an independent review should only confirm that. The room murmured in agreement, and Murdoch's jaw clenched. With all due respect, Judge Carter, you've been in this town for 5 minutes. You don't know how things work here. I know enough, Adrian replied, his gaze unwavering. I know that no one is above the law, not even the police. The tension in the room was palpable, the lines between supporters and critics of the police department drawn more clearly than ever. As the meeting concluded, Adrian stepped outside into the cool evening air, his thoughts heavy. Camille was waiting for him, her arms crossed against the chill. How did it go? She asked, her eyes searching his face. As expected, Adrian replied. Murdoch's doubling down. He's not going to make this easy. Camille sighed, linking her arm through his. You knew it wouldn't be easy, but you're doing the right thing. Adrian nodded, though the weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders. I hope so. Back at the precinct, Murdoch paced his office, his frustration boiling over. He had always prided himself on being in control, but the events of the past week had shaken his grip on the town. Whitaker knocked hesitantly on the door before stepping inside. Chief, can we talk? What is it? Murdoch snapped. Whitaker hesitated, then spoke quickly. I don't know if this is worth it. The protest, the backlash, it's getting out of hand. Murdoch's eyes narrowed. Are you questioning me, Whitaker? I'm just saying maybe we need to rethink how we're handling this, Whitaker replied, his voice trembling slightly. Murdoch's glare was icy. Let me make this clear. We don't back down. Not now, not ever. You got that. Whitaker nodded reluctantly, though doubt lingered in his eyes. The battle lines had been drawn, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the town grappled with its divisions, Adrian and Murdoch prepared for the inevitable clash that would determine the future of Westbridge. The courtroom was packed, the tension in the air so thick it felt like the walls themselves were straining to contain it. Westbridge's small courthouse had rarely seen such a crowd, but today was no ordinary day. Residents filled every bench, a mixture of curiosity, anger, and hope etched on their faces. Outside, protesters chanted slogans, their voices carrying through the open windows. At the center of it all stood Adrian Carter, resolute and calm. He had filed a formal civil rights lawsuit against Chief Murdoch and the Westbridge Police Department. It wasn't a decision he had made lightly, but the events of the past week had left him no choice. The community needed accountability, and the courtroom was the battleground where he intended to achieve it. On the opposite side of the room sat Murdoch, flanked by his attorney, Thomas McAllister, a grizzled legal veteran known for his aggressive tactics. Murdoch's face was impassive, but his eyes burned with defiance. He had spent the past few days rallying his supporters, spinning the narrative that this lawsuit was an attack on the integrity of his department and his leadership. All rise, the bailiff announced as Judge Harriet Monroe entered the room. A petite woman with a sharp gaze, Judge Monroe was known for her no-nonsense demeanor. Adrian rose alongside the rest of the room, his heart steady, despite the enormity of the moment. He had prepared meticulously for this day, knowing that the eyes of the town and beyond were on him. Judge Monroe surveyed the room, her gaze lingering briefly on Adrian before moving to Murdoch. Let's proceed, she said, her voice firm. Mr. Carter, you may begin. Adrian stepped forward, his presence commanding yet composed. Your Honor, today we are here to address a critical issue: the systemic misuse of power within the Westbridge Police Department. This is not just about one incident, it is about a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for far too long. My client, Mr. Jamal Green, was unlawfully stopped and harassed without cause. But this case is bigger than Jamal. It is about ensuring that all citizens of Westbridge can live without fear of being targeted based on the color of their skin. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by Judge Monroe's gavel. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," Judge Monroe said, her tone even. "Mr. McAllister, your opening statement." McAllister rose, his weathered face betraying no emotion. "Your Honor, my client, Chief Richard Murdoch, has served this town with honor and distinction for over 2 decades. This lawsuit is not about justice, it's about undermining the hard work of our law enforcement officers. The events in question were routine, conducted according to protocol. We will demonstrate that there was no misconduct, and we will defend the integrity of the Westbridge Police Department." Adrian didn't flinch as McAllister returned to his seat. He had expected nothing less. The first witness called to the stand was Jamal Green. Dressed in a simple button-down shirt, Jamal looked nervous but determined as he took his oath. Adrian approached him with a reassuring smile. "Mr. Green," Adrian began, "can you describe what happened on the night in question?" Jamal recounted the events in detail, his voice steady despite the occasional tremor. He described how he had been walking home from work when Officer Whitaker stopped him, accused him of looking suspicious, and conducted a search without cause. "Did you feel safe during this interaction?" Adrian asked. Jamal hesitated, his eyes flickering to Murdoch before returning to Adrian. "No, I felt powerless. Like I didn't matter, like I was just another target." Adrian nodded, his expression sympathetic. "Thank you, Mr. Green. No further questions." McAllister stood, his gaze sharp as he approached the stand. "Mr. Green, you've had previous interactions with law enforcement, haven't you?" Jamal stiffened. "Yes, but—" McAllister cut him off. "And during those interactions, weren't you found to be in possession of illegal substances?" Adrian stood quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. Irrelevant to the case at hand." Judge Monroe frowned, sustained. "Mr. McAllister, keep your questions relevant." McAllister gritted his teeth but nodded. "No further questions." The next witness was Officer Tom Whitaker. He looked visibly uncomfortable as he took the stand, avoiding Murdoch's gaze. Adrian approached him, his tone calm but probing. "Officer Whitaker, on the night in question, why did you stop Mr. Green?" Whitaker cleared his throat, his voice faltering slightly. He matched the description of a suspect we were looking for. "And what was that description?" Adrian pressed. Whitaker hesitated. "A black male, late teens to early 20s, wearing dark clothing." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "That's a rather vague description, wouldn't you agree?" Whitaker shifted in his seat. "It's what we had." "And did Mr. Green do anything to warrant further suspicion once you approached him?" Whitaker's silence spoke volumes. "No," he admitted finally. "Thank you, Officer Whitaker," Adrian said, stepping back. McAllister attempted to salvage Whitaker's testimony, but the damage had been done. The officer's hesitant responses only reinforced the perception of racial profiling. The turning point of the day came when Adrian presented a key piece of evidence, footage from a bystander's phone. The video, played for the courtroom, showed Whitaker stopping Jamal, his tone aggressive despite Jamal's calm demeanor. Murmurs rippled through the room as the video ended, the weight of the evidence undeniable. Adrian turned to the jury. "This video speaks for itself. It shows a young man treated as a suspect not because of his actions, but because of his appearance. This is not justice. This is prejudice." Murdoch's defense rested heavily on his reputation and years of service. McAllister called character witnesses who spoke of the chief's dedication and commitment to the community, but even these testimonies couldn't overshadow the growing mountain of evidence against him. As the day drew to a close, Judge Monroe adjourned the court, her expression unreadable. Adrian packed his briefcase slowly, his mind replaying the events of the day. Camille was waiting for him outside, her presence a steadying force. "You did well," she said, linking her arm through his. "It's not over yet," Adrian replied, though a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. In the coming days, the case would only intensify, with more witnesses and evidence brought to light. But as Adrian walked home that evening, he felt a glimmer of hope. The fight for justice was far from easy, but it was a fight worth waging. The courtroom was alive with anticipation as the trial entered its second week. The case had captivated not only the town of Westbridge but also the broader public, thanks to widespread media coverage. Protesters continued to gather outside, their signs and chants growing louder by the day. Inside, the tension between Adrian Carter and Richard Murdoch had reached a boiling point. Both men carried the weight of their convictions, but only one could prevail. Adrian began the day by calling a new witness to the stand, Danielle Hargrove, a local schoolteacher and longtime resident of Westbridge. Danielle, a black woman in her early 40s, exuded quiet strength as she took the oath. Ms. Hargrove, Adrian began. Can you describe your experiences with the Westbridge Police Department? Danielle hesitated, her eyes briefly darting toward Murdoch before settling on Adrian. There's been a pattern, she said carefully. Over the years, I've noticed that people of color in this town are stopped more frequently, myself included. Can you give us an example? Adrian prompted gently. Danielle nodded. A few months ago, I was driving home after a late night at school. I'd stayed to grade papers. Chief Murdoch pulled me over. He said I'd failed to signal, but I know I did. I told him as much. But he insisted on running my license. It felt unnecessary, like I was being interrogated for something I didn't do. Adrian stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. Did he find any reason to cite you? No, Danielle replied, her voice steady. He let me go after about 20 minutes. But the way he treated me like I was already guilty, it stayed with me. Thank you, Ms. Hargrove, Adrian said, stepping back. No further questions. McAllister rose next, his expression predatory. Ms. Hargrove, are you suggesting that Chief Murdoch targeted you because of your race? Danielle met his gaze without flinching. I'm saying it felt that way, yes. And yet you weren't cited or arrested. So isn't it possible the chief was simply doing his job? Danielle's jaw tightened. If that's what his job is, then there's a problem. The courtroom buzzed at her response, prompting a sharp rap of Judge Monroe's gavel. As the trial progressed, Adrian presented a series of similar testimonies, each painting a damning picture of the police department's practices under Murdoch's leadership. The defense countered by calling witnesses who praised Murdoch's commitment to the town, including business owners and longtime residents who credited him with keeping the streets safe. But the turning point came when Adrian introduced the final piece of evidence, a series of internal police memos leaked anonymously. The memos, written by Murdoch himself, revealed a pattern of racially charged language and policies targeting specific neighborhoods. Adrian held one memo aloft, his voice steady but resonant. This memo, dated 2 years ago, instructs officers to focus attention on high-risk areas. Can you clarify what you meant by that, Chief Murdoch? Murdoch, who had taken the stand reluctantly, glared at Adrian. It means we focus on areas with higher crime rates. It's standard procedure. And would you say those areas predominantly house residents of a certain demographic? Adrian pressed. Murdoch's jaw tightened. I don't see color when it comes to crime. I see statistics. Statistics, Adrian repeated, letting the word hang in the air. He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. And yet, the majority of stops conducted by your officers, stops that led to no arrests or citations, occurred in predominantly black neighborhoods. Can you explain that? Murdoch shifted in his seat. We go where the crime is. Adrian held up another memo. This one refers to a zero-tolerance approach in specific neighborhoods. Do you recall writing this? I do, Murdoch admitted. And can you explain why this zero-tolerance policy wasn't applied town-wide? Murdoch's silence spoke louder than any response he could have given. The courtroom was electric as Adrian delivered his closing argument. He spoke not just to the jury but to the community at large. Justice is not about power, he said, his voice filled with conviction. It's not about authority or control. It's about fairness. Chief Murdoch has used his position not to protect this community but to divide it. This trial is about more than one man's actions. It's about ensuring that no one in Westbridge has to live in fear of those sworn to protect them. Murdoch's defense was equally impassioned, with McAllister arguing that the lawsuit was an attack on the entire police department, a misguided attempt to villainize those who risk their lives daily. But the jury's faces betrayed their struggle. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and the memos had left an indelible mark. Outside the courthouse, tensions reached a boiling point. Protesters and counter-protesters clashed, their voices merging into a cacophony of anger and defiance. Police officers formed a line to keep the peace, though their presence only seemed to fuel the unrest. Camille stood among the crowd, her hands gripping a sign that read "Justice" for all she scanned the sea of faces, her heart pounding with both fear and hope. She had watched Adrien pour himself into this case, sacrificing sleep and peace of mind for the sake of justice. She only hoped it would be enough. As the jury deliberated, Murdoch retreated to his office at the precinct. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. He stared at his reflection in the window, his once steely resolve beginning to fracture. Whitaker entered cautiously, his expression conflicted. "Chief, you all right?" Murdoch didn't turn around. "Do you think I'm wrong, Whitaker?" The young officer hesitated. "I think maybe we could have done things differently. I think people are hurting, and maybe we didn't see it." Murdoch's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. "Get out, Whitaker." Whitaker nodded and left, leaving Murdoch alone with his thoughts. The verdict came the next afternoon. The courtroom was packed once again, the air heavy with anticipation. Adrien stood beside Jamal, his hand resting lightly on the young man's shoulder. Murdoch sat rigidly, his jaw clenched. The foreperson rose, her voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. "In the case of Green v. Murdoch, we find the defendant liable." A gasp rippled through the room, followed by scattered applause. Jamal exhaled sharply, a mix of relief and emotion washing over him. Adrien allowed himself a small smile, though his eyes remained focused on Murdoch. The judge's gavel cut through the noise. "Order in the court." Judge Monroe addressed Murdoch directly. "Chief Murdoch, the jury has found you liable for violating Mr. Green's civil rights. This court orders your immediate resignation and the implementation of independent oversight for the Westbridge Police Department." Murdoch's face was a mask of fury and humiliation, but he said nothing as he rose and left the courtroom. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers as Adrien and Jamal emerged. Reporters surged forward, microphones in hand, but Adrien held up a hand to silence them. "This isn't just my victory," he said. "It's a victory for everyone who believes in justice, equality, and accountability. But the work doesn't end here. Change is a process, and we all have a part to play." As Adrien walked away, Camille joined him, slipping her hand into his. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," Adrien corrected, his voice filled with quiet determination. The verdict sent ripples through Westbridge. The town, once comfortably divided along invisible lines of race and class, found itself forced to confront its deepest flaws. The immediate aftermath of the trial brought both celebration and unrest. For many, the court's decision was a long overdue reckoning. For others, it was a bitter pill to swallow, a challenge to the way things had always been. Adrien Carter, however, had little time to savor the victory. The weeks following the trial were filled with meetings, interviews, and community events. Each day seemed to bring a new wave of questions, concerns, and even threats. But through it all, Adrien remained steady, knowing that the fight for justice was far from over. One of Adrien's first priorities was the implementation of the court-ordered independent oversight for the Westbridge Police Department. The task was daunting, requiring careful coordination with city officials, community leaders, and law enforcement. Adrien worked closely with Gloria Samuels and a newly formed committee to select members for the Oversight Board. The committee's meetings were often contentious, with heated debates over the board's composition and authority. Murdoch's supporters, though quieter since his resignation, still wielded considerable influence in certain circles. Some argued that the Oversight Board was an overreach, a punishment that would demoralize the police force. During one particularly tense meeting, a local businessman named Henry Caldwell stood and addressed the room. "This Oversight Board is going to tie the hands of our officers," Caldwell said, his voice sharp. "We need to support our police, not undermine them." Adrien, seated at the head of the table, waited for Caldwell to finish before speaking. Mr. Caldwell, this board isn't about undermining anyone. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that every resident of Westbridge can trust the people sworn to protect them. If our officers are doing their jobs with integrity, they have nothing to fear from oversight. Caldwell opened his mouth to respond, but Gloria cut in. Adrian's right. This is about building trust, something this town desperately needs. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group. Meanwhile, Richard Murdoch grappled with the fallout of his actions. Stripped of his title and publicly disgraced, he retreated to his modest home on the outskirts of town. The once proud police chief now spent his days in isolation, avoiding the town he had once ruled with an iron fist. One evening, Murdoch received an unexpected visitor, Tom Whitaker. The young officer, now serving under an interim chief, had wrestled with guilt since the trial. Chief Whitaker said hesitantly as Murdoch opened the door, "I wanted to check on you." Murdoch stepped aside, allowing Whitaker to enter. The house was sparsely decorated, the living room dominated by an old recliner and a small television. "I'm fine," Murdoch said gruffly, sinking into the recliner. Whitaker shifted awkwardly. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. About what I did." Murdoch's gaze sharpened. "And what exactly did you do, Whitaker?" "I let it happen," Whitaker admitted, his voice trembling. "I followed orders, even when I knew they were wrong. I should have spoken up." Murdoch snorted. "Spoken up? You think anyone would have listened? This town doesn't want the truth, Whitaker. It wants a story that makes them feel good about themselves." Whitaker hesitated, then shook his head. "Maybe. But that doesn't mean we're not responsible for what we do." Murdoch didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the muted television. As Murdoch wrestled with his conscience, Adrian focused on building bridges in the community. He attended town hall meetings, visited schools, and met with local organizations to discuss ways to foster understanding and cooperation. During one visit to a high school, Adrian spoke to a group of students about the importance of justice and equality. Justice isn't just about laws, he told them. It's about fairness. It's about making sure everyone has the same opportunities, the same rights, no matter where they come from or what they look like. And that starts with all of us speaking out when we see something wrong, standing up for what's right. One student, a young black girl named Aaliyah, raised her hand. "Judge Carter, do you think things will really change here? Or is this just going to be another story people forget about?" Adrian paused, considering her question carefully. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said finally. "And it doesn't happen without effort, but I believe we can make Westbridge better. And I believe all of you have the power to make that happen." Aaliyah nodded, her expression thoughtful. The protests that had erupted during the trial gradually gave way to quieter, more sustained efforts for reform. Community members organized workshops and forums to address issues of bias, policing, and systemic inequality. While the process was slow and often fraught with setbacks, there were moments of hope and progress. One such moment came during a community policing event, where officers joined residents for a day of conversation and collaboration. Adrian attended as a guest speaker, sharing his vision for a more inclusive and accountable Westbridge. During the event, Adrian approached Whitaker, who was standing off to the side, looking uneasy. "Officer Whitaker," Adrian said, extending a hand. Whitaker hesitated before shaking it. "Judge Carter, didn't expect to see you here." "I wouldn't miss it," Adrian replied. "This is the kind of work that makes a difference." Whitaker nodded, his expression conflicted. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the trial. I want to do better. I want to be part of the solution." Adrian studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It's not easy to admit when we've been wrong, but it's the first step toward making things right." Despite the progress, not everyone in Westbridge was ready to embrace change. Resistance lingered in pockets of the community, with some residents clinging to the old ways. Adrian received his share of hate mail and threats, but he refused to let them deter him. One evening, as he and Camille sat on their porch, she brought him a cup of tea and sat beside him. "You've been quiet," she said, watching him closely. Adrian sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I knew this wouldn't be easy, but some days it feels like we're fighting a losing battle." Camille placed a hand on his arm. "You're not losing. You're planting seeds. It might take time, but they'll grow." Adrian smiled faintly, her words a balm to his weary spirit. "You always know what to say." "That's why you married me," she teased, leaning against his shoulder. As the months passed, Westbridge began to change. The Oversight Board established new protocols for the police department, including mandatory bias training and increased transparency. The changes were met with resistance at first, but gradually the community began to see the benefits. For Adrian, the work was far from over. But as he walked through the town, greeting neighbors and attending events, he felt a sense of hope. Westbridge was not perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. The first signs of spring had begun to show in Westbridge. The once barren trees along the streets were budding with fresh leaves, and the sun hung in the sky just a little longer each evening. For Adrian Carter, the change in season felt symbolic, a quiet promise of renewal after a storm. The courthouse was quieter now, the frenzy of the trial having settled into memory. But the work it sparked was far from over. Adrian sat in his office, reviewing a stack of reports from the newly established Oversight Board. Each document represented a step forward, albeit a small one, in addressing the systemic issues that had plagued the town for decades. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Laura, his assistant. "Judge Carter, there's someone here to see you." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Who is it?" "It's Richard Murdoch," Laura said, her voice tinged with surprise. Adrian paused, setting down his pen. "Send him in." Moments later, Murdoch stepped into the office. He looked markedly different from the man Adrian had faced in court. His shoulders were less rigid, his expression less combative. There was a heaviness to him, but also something else, perhaps humility, perhaps shame. "Chief Mr. Murdoch," Adrian said, rising to greet him. "Judge Carter," Murdoch replied, extending a hand. Adrian shook it, his grip firm but measured. "Have a seat," Adrian offered, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. Murdoch sat, his gaze fixed on the floor for a moment before he spoke. "I came to apologize," he said finally. Adrian studied him, waiting for him to continue. "I've had a lot of time to think since." Everything, Murdoch said, his voice steady but low. "I spent my whole career believing I was doing the right thing, that I was protecting this town. But I see now that I wasn't protecting everyone." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. Acknowledging that as a start, he said carefully. Murdoch nodded. "I know it doesn't erase what I've done, but I want to make things right. If there's any way I can help, anything I can do, I'm willing." Adrian considered his words, weighing the sincerity in his tone. If you're serious about making amends, there's plenty of work to be done. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without effort. "I understand," Murdoch said. "I want to help rebuild what I broke." Adrian extended a hand again, and this time Murdoch clasped it firmly. "Then, let's get to work." As news of Murdoch's apology spread, it sparked a new wave of dialogue in Westbridge. For some, his gesture was a sign of progress, proof that even the most entrenched figures could change. For others, it was too little, too late. But for Adrian, it was a reminder of why he had come to this town in the first place, to plant the seeds of justice, no matter how long it took for them to grow. The Oversight Board continued its work, holding monthly meetings to review police practices and address community concerns. Adrian often attended these meetings, offering guidance and ensuring that the board remained focused on its mission. One evening, during a particularly spirited discussion, Gloria Samuels turned to Adrian with a smile. "You know," she said, "when we first appointed you, I wasn't sure how things would turn out. But you've done more for this town in a year than some of us have done in a lifetime." Adrian chuckled softly. "Change is a team effort, Gloria. None of this happens without people like you." "Well," she said, raising her glass of water in a toast, "here's to more change." Meanwhile, Jamal Green was beginning a new chapter of his own. With the settlement he received as part of the lawsuit, he enrolled in college, pursuing a degree in criminal justice. Adrian had written him a glowing recommendation, and Jamal had embraced the opportunity with determination. One afternoon, Jamal visited Adrian at the courthouse. He wore a suit and tie, his posture confident and his demeanor mature. Judge Carter, Jamal greeted, his smile bright. Jamal, Adrian replied, standing to shake his hand. What brings you here? I just wanted to thank you, Jamal said. For everything. You didn't just stand up for me, you gave me a path forward. Adrian's smile widened. You earned this, Jamal. Don't let anyone take that away from you. I won't, Jamal promised. And one day I hope I can make as much of a difference as you have. As spring turned to summer, Adrian and Camille found themselves drawn into the fabric of Westbridge in ways they hadn't anticipated. They attended community picnics, volunteered at local events, and hosted gatherings at their home. Each interaction reinforced their belief that change, though slow and often difficult, was possible. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Camille leaned her head against Adrian's shoulder. Do you think we'll ever leave this town? She asked softly. Adrian took a moment to respond, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Maybe one day, he said. But not yet. There's still work to be done. Camille smiled, her hand finding his. Then we'll stay, as long as it takes. The story of Westbridge became a blueprint for other towns grappling with similar issues. Journalists and academics studied the town's journey, highlighting the lessons learned and the challenges overcome. Adrian found himself invited to speak at conferences and universities, sharing his insights and inspiring others to pursue justice in their own communities. But through it all, Adrian remained grounded, his focus always returning to the people of Westbridge. On the anniversary of the trial, the town gathered for a unity celebration in the park. Residents of all backgrounds came together to share food, stories, and music. The atmosphere was one of hope and renewal, a testament to the progress that had been made. Adrian stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as children played and neighbors laughed. Camille joined him, slipping her arm through his. You did it, she said, her voice filled with pride. We did it, Adrian corrected, his smile warm. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a golden glow, Adrian felt a sense of peace. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it was worth it. Justice, he realized, was not a destination but a path one he would continue to walk for as long as he was able.